click subscribe and hit that. All right, 1 Samuel 26. You guys ever have deja vu? So deja vu is where it's like the same event is happening, like you've been here, you've done this, and it's, why is this happening, right? It's like this really weird feeling. So David has deja vu because Saul comes out to kill him again. And it feels like we've been here, we've done this, and we're gonna watch the same scene. Like this is do you remember last time when Saul came out to get him? Do you remember what happened? Why did they split ways peacefully? David had the potential to kill him, chose not to kill him, and Saul was like, oh man, light bulb, ding, this guy's actually on my side. You know what? I'll leave him alone. Well, it doesn't stay that way. So some time goes on, and some people do some things, and here we are again. So chapter 26, then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, is not David hiding himself on the hill of Hiklah, which is on the east of Jeshimon? So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped on the hill of Hiklah, which is beside the road on the east of Jeshimon. But David remained in the wilderness. When he saw that Saul came after him in the wilderness, David sent out spies and learned that Saul had indeed come. Then David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. And David saw the place where Saul lay, with Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of his army. Saul was lying within the encampment, while the army was encamped around him. So what's the scene that we have here? Who, what, where, what's happening? David knows where his enemy is, and it sounds like he's almost surprised, like he's in the wilderness and he hears that Saul's coming out to get him, and he's like, I'm not so sure. So David went to go look, and he's like, yeah, there he is. There's that ding-dong out to get me again. So he sends some spies, confirms it, and there's a very detailed description of how Saul is laying down with his troops. Have we seen that before? We haven't. So we haven't seen this type of description, that when Saul is with his men are surrounding him. So there's 3,000 soldiers, and who's in the middle? Saul. And there's Abner. Abner is a very important person. We've talked about him a couple times, but I'm going to highlight him here because we're going to talk about Joab's brother, Abishai. And Abishai and Joab both have another brother, Asahel. And Asahel is going to be killed by Abner. So these men are going to have a lot of interaction coming up in the future. Abner is the commander of Saul's army, and he's with Saul, surrounded by 3,000 people going to get David. What instigated Saul to go get David? Saul was fine. Everything was fine. There was peace. And what happened? The Ziphites, what did they say? The Ziphites actually appeared a couple of chapters ago, and they did the very same thing. When David was hiding, the Ziphites went to Saul, and they were like, hey dog, David's over here. Bunch of snitches. And this time, Saul is minding his own business, David is minding his own business, and here come the Ziphites, not minding their own business. They're snitches, they're muckrakers. Anybody know what a muckraker is? A muckraker comes from like the 1930s, 1920s, I think it is. It's a political term of a person who instigates political fights. They scrape up all the dirt and they throw dirt. They're muckrakers. A muckraker is an instigator. So these are troublemakers and these are dividers, and they show up to cause problems. And then you get Saul. Now, Saul is supposed to be a leader, supposed to be cunning, is supposed to be wise and understanding and to perceive truth. But here, he's naive, he's foolish, and he's stubborn. He listens to those around him who instigate him to go against David when there is no reason for it. So he listens to those who spread libel, those who are slanderers and gossips, and he truly shows himself as a fool. And then we find verse 3 through 5 that David is alert and David is proactive. So David has his ear to the ground. He's paying attention. He hears rumors that Saul is coming out to get him again, and he doesn't take it for granted. He's like, there's no way. We reconciled. We had a good relationship after I cut off the hem of his garment. He wouldn't come out to get me now. No, David's like, well, he could be back. David is alert enough to know that he still has potential danger. And so he's going to respond, and he's going to send out the spies. Okay, any questions? Make it a sensei. Verses 6 through 12. Then David said to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Joab's brother Abishai the son of Zeruiah, who will go down with me into the camp to Saul? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there lay Saul, sleeping within the encampment, with his spear stuck in the ground at his head. And Abner and the army lay around him. Then Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let us go. So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake. Why? For they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. So this is interesting because you have an encampment of 3,000 people. You have the king who's out to get you, and David has sent spies, and he knows for certain that Saul is there to attack him and kill him. And his next response is, let's go down there. That's not the most logical decision. I'm the leader of 600 people. I'm responsible for 600 people and their families, which they actually don't count them. So it could be more than 600 people. And David's thoughts are, I should go down there and sneak into this camp. Who's going to go with me? Now, if you heard this plan, would you volunteer? It takes a lot of courage, even then. Like, I guess in our day and age, it'd be like The Rock. You like going down there with The Rock and you're like, yeah, you know, he's big and strong. It can't go south. There's only 3,000 soldiers down there. David asks for a volunteer. And we don't know if this was by divine revelation, if he used the Urim or the Thummim, or if there was a prophet. There's no indication that tells us that David was told by God to go down there. It's just a simple fact that David saw an opportunity to be very sneaky. So he asks for volunteers, and courage, Abishai, volunteers, and they go down there. And what do they find? Anybody have like snapping ligaments? When you walk, do they pop? How loud is super loud? So I fractured my ankle as a kid, and now when I walk, it pops, and it's loud. And when I'm trying to sneak, so like she refuses to stay asleep when I get up to leave. I'm like, I want to go read. I'm going to sneak out of bed. I can get halfway down the hallway and my ankle pops and she'll wake up. David is a hardened warrior. He's been through some things. Abishai has been through some things. I'm pretty sure these guys make a lot of noise, even if they're trying not to. So everybody's in a deep sleep from God is what we find out in verse 12. So they go down there and Saul's fast asleep, everybody's sleeping, and they go sneaking in there. And what's interesting to me is that for these men, one, we know it's divine. We know like God has done this thing, but also there's a sense of peace when it comes to sleep like that. If you're anxious, if you're nervous, are you ever so excited that you're sleeping and it feels like you've slept 8 hours and you wake up and you look at the light or you look at your watch and it's been like 2 hours and you're just so anxious so you go back to sleep and you wake up every hour? These men aren't doing that. They're out cold. They feel like everything in their life is great. that they're out there in a peaceful country, no problems, everything's wonderful. There's 3,000 of us, there's only a couple hundred of them, and they're just fast asleep. There are sentries. There are people who are standing at attention, alert, to make sure that nobody sneaks up and attacks him. So verse 7 also tells us that, so Saul was asleep in the encampment, and his spear was stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner was right next to him. Right? So the commander of the army is sleeping next to the king, and the spear is right next to his head. Weaponry in this time is actually hard to come by. There was a time in Israel's history where they had 0 weapons. They were ruled over by a foreign nation, and they took all their blacksmiths, they took all their weapons, and that was back in Saul's day. They have been gathering weapons as they have been fighting wars, and those weapons are valuable. You don't just go throwing it into the ground. You actually oil it, you sharpen it, you keep it clean, and you keep it ready for battle. You don't misuse your tools unless your guard is absolutely down and you don't actually think you're going to be using it. So it's the king's spear. He's like, oh, I'll sit in the back while the 3,000 dudes go do my dirty work. So you can see his leadership and his lack of preparement right there. And then also, it's like seeing somebody in the military just like taking their rifle and then just sticking it in the ground, just getting dirt in the barrel. Just like, oh, I'm just going to set this over here, no problem. It's foolish. You don't do that. We know you don't do that. Nobody's acting with wisdom right now. In verse 8, Abishai says to David, God has done this thing. God has given your enemy into your hand. Now, please let me strike him. This is a little different than last time. Do you remember what they said to David last time? Saul is here. God has given him to you. David, you go kill him. This time, Abishai is like, nah, I know better. If I really want this done, I'm not going to tell David to do it. David, let me do it, man. Please, let me do it. He says, God has given you this opportunity. Now, has God given him this opportunity? Absolutely. Just like he did last time. He put him in a deep sleep and he gave him the opportunity to take the life of his enemy. But David knows better. And so David actually has a new perspective that he has learned more things about God. Last time, his response was, you can't touch the Lord's anointed. There's a head knowledge that says we are not allowed to touch God's anointed. That's a rule written in stone. It's on his heart. And he knows this, and he won't betray God's law. But here, he says in verse 9, but David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put a hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? That's what he said last time. And he goes on in verse 10, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. What is he saying right there? God will take care of him. I don't have to kill him because the Lord will kill him one way or another. Natural causes, in battle, however it functions, God will handle it. What did David learn that makes him say that? Nabal, what happened? He had a heart attack after David was going to go kill him, right? David was going to avenge himself on his enemy. And Abigail stepped up to the plate as a godly woman, and she's like, come on, man, give us peace. Let there be peace. Don't shed innocent blood. And the Lord used her to calm David down. And David learned something that day. He learned that the Lord will avenge. See, he knew that it was wrong to kill this man. But now he's experienced God personally, and that experience has led to a deeper theology, which says, not only will I not do it, but the Lord will take care of it. One way or another, God will justify me against my enemy. And that's going to be his argument with Saul coming up in the next couple of verses. 13 through 14. Then David went over to the other side and stood far off on the top of the hill with a great space between them. And David called to the army and to Abner the son of Ner, saying, will you not answer, Abner? Then Abner answered, who are you who calls to the king? And David said to Abner, are you not a man Who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy the king, your lord. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you have not kept watch over your Lord, for the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is and the jar of water that was at his head. I skipped a very important part. Instead of killing him, David took the spear and he took the jug of water. So he took proof with him and they left. And then he just went right outside the camp and like tapped on his shoulder and he's like, hey, I'm here. No, so he went really far away. David still doesn't trust these guys. He still doesn't give them a chance, and he runs off onto the hillside, and it's very clear that he went very far away and he had to yell at these dudes. It's interesting that they wouldn't wake up with two dudes crawling all over them. But when David runs away and he's a faint voice in the distance, everybody springs to. He finds a safe retreat, and then he calls Abner to a performance review. He's like, Abner, you are a bad employee and we have to review your conduct. And he calls him out and he says, Abner, are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? What is he saying? Why does he have no equal? Because he's the commander and chief under the king. If anybody should have been protecting the king, who should it have been? If anybody was making sure that the sentries were awake and doing their job, who should it have been? Who failed when the king almost died? Abner. And who's concerned about that? David, right? Who's the real enemy here? That's the point. Who is like you? Are you not a man? And in my mind, it's, are you not the man in Israel? You're the guy. And I'm curious, with all of David's troubles, with all the backbiting and slander and all the things that are going on in the king's ear, I'm curious if Abner was one of those voices whispering against David. And so David takes opportunity to call him out and hold him accountable to his failure. Is he the slanderer and gossip who starts all of these problems for David? We don't know. It's a question. So he says in verse 15, for one of the people came in to destroy the king, your Lord. You failed. In verse 16, this thing that you have done is not good. What kind of a statement is that? You suck. You're a failure. It's an understatement. Like, imagine an employee at your job making the world's worst mistake, like a cashier who accidentally gives away like $200 to somebody, or leaving some food out and causing somebody to get food poisoning, or putting kids in a really bad situation when you're a babysitter, like absolutely failing their job, like making havoc and ruin of the position that they hold. And you just stand up and you say, that was not good. It's meant to be an understatement. It's meant to stand out. And in your mind, you're supposed to think, that's way worse than not good. It's to drive you to that conclusion, to think of how bad it is. And then he says, there's consequences. That's not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die. You deserve to die because you have not kept watch over the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is and where the jar is at his head. You failed your king, but you left vulnerable God's man. That's David's qualm. It's not that you failed as a political figure or as a soldier. You failed as a man or woman of God in protecting the one whom God has chosen. You have not defended his anointed. You have disrespected and disregarded the Lord, not man, and you deserve to die. And then he says, where's the spear? Why would he say that? Where's the spear? The spear and water is proof of potential death. And it's interesting because here it's a potential death for the king, but with Jesus, it was proof of death on the cross. They pierced him with a spear, and it was blood and water that came out. The king at his head could have been murdered and driven through, but he was given mercy and freedom, and the proof was in the spear and in the water. 17. You notice how Abner doesn't give a response? He said, "Who are you, Abner?" "Ha! King, got any words?" Verse 17, so Saul recognized David's voice and said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And David said, "It is my voice, my Lord, O king." And he said, "Why does my Lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done, and what evil is on my hands? Now therefore let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord, that they have driven me out this day, that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, Go serve other gods. Now therefore let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea, like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains." So Saul's response here is quite interesting. He calls out and he says, "Hey, David, is that you?" And what does he refer to David as? "My son." Is that a friendly thing to say? It is a friendly thing to say. It is actually an honorable thing to say. It is a very respectful thing to say. And Saul changes his tune and says, "Oh, my son David," only after being given the opportunity to die. Then he recognizes the true value of David. So he changes his tune real quick, but you'll notice that David doesn't reciprocate. Last time this happened, David went out and was like, "My father." And then he was like, "Oh, my son David." Here, he calls him his king. He says, "You're my master, you're my king. Why have you come out against me?" He doesn't say, "Yes, my father, here I am." David is wounded, David is hurt, and he's not receiving false honor. He's not receiving that false relationship because he knows Saul will never come around. For this to happen again, David has lost his sense of connection to Saul. David has always been a very caring and loving individual to the king, always and forever. But now he won't reciprocate in that lie that Saul is trying to sell. He says in verse 18, "Why are you here? What is your cause?" It's almost like saying, "Where's your warrant? Why are you searching for me? You're coming out because of slanderers and liars." He says, if God is doing something in your heart, then he would accept an offering. What is David saying? By saying God would accept an offering, what is he saying about the resolution that he can find with the Lord? There would be an avenue to solution. There would be an avenue to reconciliation. He said, if I offended God, I would have a sacrifice I could give. God would receive the lamb and show me mercy. God would be forgiving and loving and give me pardon. If my problem with you was with God, there's resolution. He says, but if it's from men, then let God curse them. Now you're making yourself an enemy with God. So he's saying this, no matter what's happening right now, God is in the middle. He is the mediator between us. And if it is justified, you against me, then he will receive an offering. If you come against me because of men, then God will judge you and yours. Then let them be cursed. He's allowing God to step in the middle. On a side note, this is very important for marriage. You put God in the middle of your marriage. When there's issues, the solution is God. Where if you have person-to-person problems, God steps in and he brings reconciliation through forgiveness and offering and all this good stuff. But when you don't allow the Lord to step in, that's Saul's problem. Saul does not respect and recognize God. Therefore, he will always have problems with David. But if he let the Lord just decide, there would be reconciliation. That's David's argument. If God is in control, we could make peace. But if it's between men, let the Lord curse them. Verse 19. Now therefore let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day, that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. Therefore, let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord. For the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea. What does he start talking about here? What's the heritage and the presence of the Lord? There's an inheritance that they all receive, but he talks about the presence of the Lord. What is the presence of the Lord? In the Jewish mindset, if you wanted to draw close to God, where would you go? Temple, the Ark of Presence, the temple of the Lord, the tabernacle. David has been running for years, and he's been hiding for years. Where's the one place he can't go that he wishes he could? He wants to go to church. He wants to gather with God's people. He wants to worship, offer sacrifices, and give thanksgiving. He wants to celebrate the feasts. He wants to do what God's commanded the Jews to do. But he has been cast out of their society, and he is living in caves. And if he shows his face, he's liable to be killed. And so that's the statement that he's having here. This is the cry of his heart, is that he has been alienated from the services of God. He's been alienated from church. People have said, go serve gods elsewhere. Go serve foreign gods. You are not acceptable to the heritage of God. The heritage of God is the temple. God said, I will dwell with you. I will be in Israel, and you will come to me on these feasts. You, all of the men of adult age, are to come and worship me. And David was banned. The king had to be there. The king's men had to be there. If David showed up, he would be in trouble. And so we haven't really discussed that aspect of David's life. We've talked about him having to get rid of his family, to put them in hiding, to keep them safe. We've talked about him running and traveling and having to feed these men who are actually not very friendly people. They don't like being led. Later on, they're going to try to stone David because some things happen. So David is practically alone. He's cast out from his family. He's cast out from his society. He can't go home, and he can't worship his God in the temple. When we read the Psalms and he cries about his heart longing to go up to Jerusalem. It's actually not in Jerusalem at this point, but he's longing to go with the fellowship of believers and to worship God as a congregation. Those songs were rooted in his heart in these days when he was not able to freely worship God, when he was not free to live out his faith. He had to hide in a hole for his life, and it hurt him. And he cries out to the king, and he says, why have you come out against me? And why am I cast out from the presence of the Lord? Why am I alienated from God? Let him decide between us. You come out against a flea. You're chasing a pigeon in the forest. I'm nobody. There's no reason for this. He's really at his wit's end. He's so thoroughly exhausted and fed up with everything that he's been going through for years. And now he's being hunted again? What do you think Saul says? So Saul says, I have sinned. What do you think Saul would say? There's nothing he can say. What do you say to that? when you have been persecuting somebody for no legitimate cause, and they call you out and say, I've spared your life twice. I have been gracious to you, and you have considered me your enemy from day one. So Saul's response is disingenuous. It's not going to be received by David. He's not going to believe what he's saying. Saul can't be empathetic of the experience that David's going through. So David doesn't think that he is genuine. So he says in verse 21, then Saul said, I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly, and I have made a great mistake. I'm sorry. Boo-hoo. He says, I've sinned. Come on home. Come on home, man. You can come worship God again. He's like, I've been a fool and I've made a really big mistake. A really big mistake? Come on. Saul says, but I think David really needed to hear, but I don't think David received it. There's a difference. Yeah. You can hear, but not receive. And that's what God says, I will reject your prayers. He says, when I won't hear, he's not receiving them. Obviously, he hears them. On a side note. Verse 22, David answered, here is the spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it. Here's your spear. What I love about this, one, David's not going to take it and keep it because he's not, a thief. But he gives him this spear because every time the king looks at that spear, he's going to think something. What is he going to think? That spear could have killed me. That spear could have been the weapon that ended my life, but it wasn't. And now that spear represents my life being given back to me. It is a spear of remembrance. What about the water jug? Every time he gets thirsty, what is he going to be thinking? Every sip is a sip of gratitude. God is so gracious to Saul. And Saul does not receive God's grace. He receives it in vain. God is so good to him, and he just throws himself off a cliff. It gets worse. Chapter 28, Saul goes bonkers. David says, come get the spear. I'm giving it back to you. And he also says in verse 23, the Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. What was David's reward for his righteousness and faithfulness? He would eventually become king, but he's saying it here. He's saying the Lord will reward righteousness and faithfulness. I didn't touch your life. Saul was David's reward. David lived faithfully to the Lord, and God rewarded it by serving up Saul on a silver platter. And yet David says, I would not touch the Lord's anointed, proving his righteousness and proving his faithfulness. And so he's really telling Saul, I will continue to be a righteous, faithful individual. Yeah. And God will reward the righteous and faithful individual. It's a little bit of a backhand. It's a little bit of a smack to Saul, because God is good all the time for those who love God. Your life is hard. I wonder what went wrong. I wrote here, I showed you mercy. May the Lord show me mercy. There's a quid pro quo with God. I've been merciful to you today. God will give me my life in return since I've treated you with mercy. Verse 25, Saul's response. Then Saul said to David, blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and will succeed in them. So David went his way and Saul returned to his place. You are great and you will be great. That's Saul's response. And they just separated ways, and it's the end. They will never talk again. Now let's read chapter 27, verse 1. Then David said in his heart, Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Saul is hopeless. There is zero chance that Saul will change. And David gives up all hope. You know what we call this? Grace coming to an end. And David says, I have to leave. There is no chance that Saul will ever change. It is time to leave. And he's going to make a drastic change. Romans 16, 17 through 18 talks about divisive people. Divisive people come in, they cause problems, they cause divisions, and they lead people into devastation. And what it says in verse 18 is that we are to avoid such people, like the Ziphites. When divisive people come in, we have to identify them and crush them. So if somebody comes into our group and starts causing problems, it is everybody's responsibility to handle that. Me as a leader, I'll handle it. Been there, done that. Super awkward. It's like the best part of being a leader. But that's the sensitivity of unity. And when somebody comes in to cause division and to cause problems like that, like Saul and David were perfectly fine. They didn't see eye to eye, but they saw close enough. And they left each other alone. And then the Ziphites showed up and they caused problems. Then we see theology and application. So David knew things about God. Then he experienced some things about God. And then he had true knowledge of God. When he walked through those stages of anger and grief and frustration, he learned something experientially about God. That he now knows the Lord because God justified him in taking Naaman's life. And so he took that same knowledge of God and he applied it to Saul a second time. And he's like, nope, the Lord will handle it. And then he holds Abner accountable. And he says, you failed to do your job. Now, we as Christians don't tend to do this very well because the world around us has pointed their big bony fingers in our face and said, you can't judge people. And who are you to tell people to do this or do that? No, you have a job to do and you're accountable to do your job. You're a mother, be a mother. You're a father, be a father. You don't get to just leave your family. You have a position, you have a role, and we will hold you accountable to that role. You're a Christian in this community, you're in this body of Christ, and we're all accountable to each other. And so being accountable is not a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing. Abner's actually going to go on and gain David's trust. Later on, Saul's going to die, and there's going to be a division in the kingdom, and Abner will come and strike a deal with David, and David will actually receive him to be a commander in his army. Abner learned from the accountability that David thrust upon him and said, you failed your job, you deserve to die, and then David gave him a job. This is the fruit of righteousness, God's mercy. David says, God will reward righteousness and faithfulness, and we will receive our due reward. Forgiving and rejecting. This is a tough one. He forgave Saul, but he didn't trust Saul ever again. And so he rejected Saul. He separated himself from Saul once and for all to never even come close to this man ever again. And it came at great sacrifice. He's actually going to leave Israel and he's going to go to their enemy, the Philistines. This is the second time he's done this. The next time it's going to be a little different. He's coming with an entourage. He separates from bad people without bitterness. David's not bitter. He's not holding a grudge. He's forgiving Saul. He's letting the Lord take control and handling it. But he's going to separate himself and not have a relationship with that person any longer. Those are the applications.